So first of all, I'd like to thank Missouri History Museum and all the people that work here for this opportunity to speak with you this morning. About 20 years ago, 2004, marked the 100th anniversary of the 1904 World's Fair, and by pure coincidence, the National Lesbian Gay Task Force was having their national convention, which was called Creating Change, their annual convention in St. Louis that year. Now, as founding vice president of the 1904 World's Fair Society, and also someone who's been involved with LGBT organizations in St. Louis for a number of years, it occurred to me that there might possibly be some lesbian or gay people who attended the 1904 World's Fair. What I found out led me to creating my first presentation, which was then called Gay Aspects of the 1904 World's Fair, which I presented at the 2004 Creating Change Convention in St. Louis. And when I learned last year that the Missouri History Museum here was not only doing a spectacular makeover of their 1904 World's Fair exhibit, and at the same time opening the first ever major exhibit focusing on, I'll get a running start on this, LGBTQIA plus St. Louis history just a month later, I knew that I needed to offer a much updated presentation for their consideration. And that is because understanding our past helps us to understand our lives today. In the 2 decades since my first presentation on the topic, I've uncovered many more amazing people, unexpected connections, and surprising aspects that linked over a dozen LGBTQIA people to the 1904 World's Fair. And in doing so, it may challenge us to open our minds to better understand some people that we thought we already knew quite well. And so, in bringing this being the LGBTQ History Month, which by the way started right here in St. Louis by St. Louis and Rodney Wilson, it's fitting that we now explore the intersection between these two major and concurrent Missouri exhibits, the 1904 World's Fair, and also Gateway to Pride. And if you can see, I'm a big fan of Venn diagrams, right? Okay? And that is that LGBT people who were present and part of the 1904 World's Fair, they were merely hidden in plain sight. Now we're going to be exhibiting the intersection, taking a look at what it was like for LGBT people to live during a historically significant time and place here in St. Louis. We'll be looking at why it was an important part of their life, that the important part of their life was hidden. We'll be recognizing that they were indeed part of the fair history, and also we'll be acknowledging and celebrating their contributions, which is very important as serving inspiration for other LGBTQ and straight people to know that they were part of that history. Some of those LGBT people that we'll be talking about include a Congressional Medal of Honor awardee, a major 20th century poet, an aviator, and actually 2 inventors, an Apache translator, a groundbreaking novelist, British general, internationally famous sculptress, an Olympic medalist, and musicians and artists, and also up to 1 million LGBTQ fair attendees. To put things in context, we know that the fair took place at the end of Victorian era when things were rapidly changing due to new discoveries and emerging technologies. The main theme of the fair was education and discovery, which fits in very nicely with the concept that nothing would be impossible, inspiration would whisper, and genius would point. They truly did achieve some impossible things in the building and the content of the 1904 World's Fair, that experience. It was truly a massive undertaking, world's largest fair ever, over 12,000 acres, 3 square miles, 13 times larger than today's Magic Kingdom in Florida. It was said you'd have to walk about 150 miles to see it all, with 1,500 buildings, 70,000 exhibits, 35 miles worth of roads, 75 miles worth of exhibit, 12 huge palaces containing over 5 million square feet indoors and 6 million square feet outdoors. And if you can look closely, you can see these, you can see these little dots here, which are actually people in front of one of the typical size palaces there. It was truly massive. And in addition to all of that, millions experienced the fair because it was truly an international event with international outreach and people, with participants by 53 countries and 49 states and territories. This brought people from around the world experiencing each other's cultures while they're here. It was also the hosting of the 3rd modern Olympics, the first that took place in Athens, Greece, where it all started, the 2nd in Paris, France, and the 3rd, well, why don't we just hold it here in St. Louis? Also, this was an election year, which we're in right now. The Democratic National Convention held some of their meetings at the World's Fair, and there were important international congresses or convention that took place, bringing ideas and people from around the world to share their knowledge. 20 million people attended, 50 cents admission, and for that reason, it was one of the few World's Fairs to ever turn a profit. It took 3 years to build, but was only open for 185 amazing days from April 30th to December 1st. And here we see where we are right now. We can find, and then this is a map of the fair as it existed back there in 1904. And if we flip that map around, we'll see some of the locations where some of the people were exhibited or where they stayed during the 1904 World's Fair, including the Pike, the site of the first modern Olympic Games in the United States, and also Washington University grounds. And this is a view toward, looking toward just to the left where the Pike was located. And also the crowning jewel of the fair being the festival hall with a dome larger than St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, holding the world's largest pipe organ, and also holding up to 2,500 people in this building. Now, when we talk about LGBTQ, what exactly are we talking about? Who does it include? What does it include? Well, it includes the notion of sexual orientation, whether it be lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, or asexual, asexual being having no particular romantic or sexual interest in others. It also includes gender presentation, how people present themselves to the world, whether it be masculine, feminine, or androgynous. It includes gender identity, being cisgender, meaning that you identify yourself as the same gender that is on your birth certificate. Transgender, you identify yourself as something other than what's on your birth certificate. Non-binary, you don't identify as either one, or agender, just no identity of either or any of them. And of course, the anatomical or biological characteristics, whether they be female, male, or intersex. And in the case of intersex, the incidence of that ranges anywhere between 1 in 100 to 1 in 5,000 people, depending on how you define that, whether it's just physical characteristics, whether they're internal, external, or whether you're looking at the DNA of the person. And finally, cultural. Since some cultures, indigenous mainly, will have members that consider themselves to be either two-spirit are third gender or more. Today, the average number of United States persons who identify as LGBTQ is 5.5%. Some people say as high as 7%. There's a range, though, depending on when you were born. Generation Z has a higher self-identification of LGBTQ plus today than people of the silent generation born 1945 or earlier. And this is from a 2023 Gallup poll. So, here for a moment, if we could travel back in time 120 years to the time of the 1904 World's Fair, what would life be like for an LGBT person in 1904? Well, first of all, they would likely have a very limited self-awareness and understanding of what they were experiencing internally. In addition to that, there would be a very limited available amount of information about just general human sexuality, and that information would be likely limited to either academicians or also medical professionals. They would likely be experiencing personal shame, self-loathing, or maybe even suicidal thoughts. If they were out, if other people knew about them, they risk losing job, housing, being disowned by family or friends. They might be subjected to physical or mental harm, and because having same-sex relations was illegal coast to coast, they could be thrown in prison or possibly have their life threatened or murdered. Any written or records or physical evidence that they might have been LGBTQ might have been destroyed either before their death or after their death. And because of that, their true, authentic identity was often lost to history and was often hidden from sight. So with all of that in mind, what are some of the terms that might have been used to describe LGBTQ plus people in 1904? Homosexual, which was a medical term developed to describe a whole class of people. Psychopathic sexual pervert, sexual variant, deviant, degenerate, defective, or an invert. Now, these are all clinical terms that were regularly used by respected medical professionals to describe LGBTQ people. In addition to that, another term that was sometimes used was a yearning, a sodomite, a pansy, and one of my favorite, a confirmed bachelor. Okay, and more. So, what was the treatment of LGBT people in the United States in 1904? Well, legally, same-sex activity was illegal nationwide. And for that reason, a person could be thrown in jail, subjected to hard labor, or receive other severe punishment. Medically, they might have been treated, since this was considered an illness, a sickness. They might have been subjected to psychotherapy, hypnosis, or aversion therapy which might have included cold water baths, purging, or in some cases, medical castration. In addition to that, religious institution might have been using prayer to save those persons' souls. And in addition to that, they could have been banished and condemned to eternal hell by their lifelong place of worship. Societally, occasionally LGBTQ plus people were tolerated or ignored, okay? Some people took a live and let live approach, and they might have been considered exotic or quaint individuals. However, they could also be subjected to ridicule, condemnation, being ostracized, marginalized, or isolated, and they also could possibly receive assault, murder, or attempt suicide. However, internationally, things were in many countries more progressive. For instance, in Germany, the sexologist Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld rejected the degenerative theory of homosexuality in 1901, and 2 years later, he conducted the very first large-scale survey concerning sexual preference, in which he found that 2.2% of men interviewed identified themselves as men who had sex with men. In England, the publisher Edward Carpenter published the first English language writings of same-sex love in 1903. And then the Netherlands in 1900 published the first documented lesbian personal ads in their newspapers. Russia was very progressive in that they changed their condemnation for 5 years to Siberia to a mere 3 months. So I guess that marked some degree of progress in 1903. So we can see here that there was really a compelling reason and need to hide one's identity and authentic identity. But with so much limited evidence, how do we know if someone would have been considered LGBTQ back in 1904 using today's understanding of what it means to be LGBTQ+. Since today's terminology and understanding of that identity didn't exist in 1904. However, if we examine the total historical evidence of that person's behavior, practices, their writings, and other circumstances, and at the same time look at if their total historical evidence is also not typical of their straight peers, and also closely parallels that of an LGBTQ+ person today, then we might rightly consider that 1904 person as likely being LGBTQ+. And if we take a look at some photos from that time period as part of the Nene Treadwell collections, we see some evidence, some very touching, in many cases, evidence of some atypical presentation, such as this one of two men. And this one. These are all from the 1904 World's Fair time period. Or this one, and I don't know if you can see, but this one man has his hand on the knee of the other one, but the man on the right has his knee over the leg of the other man. So we can safely say that these were more than just good friends. And similarly, this photo. And finally, one of my favorite, from 1900s. This 1895 film shows two men dancing, and that was truly an atypical experience back then. Some of the early St. Louis accounts of LGBTQ+ people are shown upstairs in the excellent Gateway to Pride exhibit, including this 1843 masquerading ordinance prohibiting anyone presenting themselves in clothing belonging to persons of opposite sex. And then there's this St. Louis Post-Dispatch article that refers to Walt Whitman's visit to St. Louis, and here he's shown with his friend, who is his life partner, Peter Boyle, and there's a newspaper clipping in the lower right-hand corner from that visit. Unfortunately, Walt Whitman passed away before 1904. In 1882, Oscar Wilde, at the age of 28, visited St. Louis, and here is a newspaper clipping talking about his talk at the Mercantile Library Hall down on Locust Street, followed by a visit to Shaw's Garden. And you'll notice that the illustration on the right, the man on the extreme, on the left, the man on the extreme left is a caricature of Oscar Wilde, shown as a foppish pansy. But he was tolerated at that time because he was an entertainer. He was a brilliant writer also. But unfortunately, 13 years later, he ended up in jail in London for gross indecency. And that news was made worldwide and had a chilling effect on many LGBT people in terms of willingness to be public about their true identity. Some additional early accounts that can be found in the Gateway to Pride exhibit include this groundbreaking autobiography, The Story of a Life, and I can still remember going to Our World 2 to purchase this copy, and it really spurred my interest in taking further look at the possibility of LGBT people at the 1904 World's Fair. And in addition to that, it was the very first gay autobiography published in the US, which was very groundbreaking by the fact that it was also published by a major St. Louis medical publisher for the purposes of enlightening the medical profession. So this information, even though it was published, was not widely available. He identifies also some gay cruising sites, including this site at Sixtenala, which is close to the Railway Exchange building. He was 33 years old at the time of the 1904 World's Fair. We have no way of knowing, but he may well have visited the 1904 World's Fair, but we'll never know. Some other early St. Louis accounts of LGBT people included this St. Louis Society of St. Louis City Hospital, which referred to two men who showed an unnatural fondness for each other. And then during the 1904 World's Fair year, the St. Louis Medical Journal talks about a man who seeks castration to cure his homosexuality. He did undergo the procedure, and of course, it didn't cure his homosexuality. 2 years after the fair, the St. Louis Medical Review published an essay talking about the problem of sexual variance. And then in 1907, the St. Louis Medical Journal published an article that talked about black men arrested for masquerading as women and dancing with white men at a Mississippi Levee dance hall near Eads Bridge. And in this one article, they accomplished the feat of being both racist and also homophobic in one fell swoop, by today's standards. Some notable straight people that were present and or participated at the fair included these luminaries. You might recognize some names, and it'd be really interesting to have been able to travel back in time and experience and see them firsthand. But in addition to these straight people, there were some notable LGBTQ people who also experienced or contributed to the 1904 World's Fair, and after their name, I've included their age at the 1904 World's Fair. In 1904, put things into historical context. They included Jane Addams, who was 44 at the time of the fair. She was a noted social worker, activist, and a women's suffragette. She established Hull House in Chicago, which provided education and also health care for immigrants and also the poor. And for that, she was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, and she's recorded as living with her life partner, Mary Smith, for 43 years. So we can safely say, by today's standards, that she would very likely be considering herself to be lesbian. Dr. Mary Edward Walker was 72 when she attended the 1904 World's Fair. She was the second woman in the United States to have graduated from medical school, since, of course, women were not allowed to go to medical school, unsurprisingly. She was the only woman at the time to have earned the Congressional Medal of Honor for her Civil War medical service, providing help on the battlefield and during the Civil War. She married her husband while wearing a trousers and a man's coat, similar to what we see here. She divorced him 13 years later. She fought for women's rights in health and dress reform throughout her lifetime and visited the fair on July 11th, was later honored with a U.S. postal stamp, and we can safely say that the way she presented herself was atypical. That's all we know for sure. Kate Chopin was not only St. Louis novelist when she visited the fair at the age of 54, but she also is unusual that she, at the time, wrote about women's sexuality and desires, which was virtually unheard of, and even more so, the critics such as Emily Toth, who wrote the book Unveiling Kate Chopin, talked about her writing about lesbian themes and characters in her 3 books. She had a very close relationship with her childhood friend, and her identity still remains to this day inconclusive. And tragically, while visiting the fair, she died 2 days later on August the 20th. T.S. Eliot was a teenager at 16, a native St. Louisan, and he attended the fair throughout the summer because he had one of those World's Fair passes. He later became one of the major poets of the 20th century, having written The Wasteland and J. Alfred Prufrock, and I can still remember from high school being assigned to read both of those poems. He had been cited as being homosexual by several of his close peers, so he very likely today would be considered to be a gay man. Harriet Hosmer, who's featured prominently in the Gateway to Pride exhibit, was at the time the most famous sculptor of her time. Her works won multiple awards at the fair, including her Thomas Hart Benton statue, which was formerly on display in Tower Grove Park, and her world-famous Beatrice Cenci sculpture, which is now on display for anyone to see at the University of Missouri St. Louis Library. And I can remember when I was in in New Zealand, and going to their National Museum, seeing a copy of that same sculpture. She also was a member of a colony of lesbian artists, so she too might today be considered to have been lesbian. Lord Baden-Powell visited at the age of 47. He was a British officer who fought in the Boer War. He was also the founder of the Boy Scouts. He attended the fair on October 19th to compete in an advanced kite flying contest. Now, this was serious business because to win this contest, you had to keep a kite up in the air 500 feet for a period of 2 hours. Now, this is done just right before the Wright brothers had flown their planes, so there weren't any planes as we know today. They might have had gliders or hot air balloons, which we'll be talking about in just a little bit. Major Kenneth McLaurin was called Boy by Lord Baden-Powell. He was his best friend for over 20 years. McLaurin was later injured in the Boer War, and I mention this because many of us know that on the grounds of the 1904 World's Fair was a major display that recreated the actual battles that took place on the Boer War just about 6 years prior to that. But he had been cited by his biographer that he was gay. And in addition to that, there's this telegraph that McLaren had sent to Baden-Powell. And it was kept in a scrapbook by Baden-Powell's wife for many years, and later on, more recently, was put up for auction because of what that telegraph to Baden-Powell said. And that was, "Could you put me up Friday night incognito?" Which raises some interesting questions. So moving on to another person who was important at the 1904 World's Fair was George Poage, who at age 24 attended the fair. He was an outstanding African-American high school athlete and also at the University of Wisconsin. He also competed in track and field at the Olympic Games. Noting that there was a separate segregated viewing area at those Olympic Games, and he too faced racial discrimination while he was at the fair. But in spite of all of that, he won the bronze medal for the 200-yard and 400-yard hurdles, making him the first African American to be awarded an Olympic medal in modern history. After the fair, he worked at the segregated Sumner High School in St. Louis as the English department chair and coach. And later on, in 1920, he moved from Minnesota to Chicago, where he worked and spent the rest of his life after working for 30 years as a postal clerk. The latter part of his life, he lived in obscurity, and his obit mentions that he was a lifelong confirmed bachelor. Some 50 years later, though, his accomplishments were recognized by being named, having a park named after him in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And at that 2013 dedication of the park, which this statue was created for, his great-nephew spoke and was later interviewed by a local newspaper writer, and his great-nephew mentioned that, my great-uncle was gay. So there's a confirmation. Another man who was a man of mystery by today's standards, but was extremely important not only for his connection to the 1904 World's Fair, but also an invention that had worldwide impact. And that was because he invented a water purifying process that was first used at the 1904 World's Fair that took muddy Mississippi River water and converted into clean, clear water that would be used throughout the fair to fill the lagoons and also the Grand Basin. They had originally planned on having to haul in millions of gallons of clear water to fill the basin and for the fountains and everything else. It's still a revolutionary process that's used worldwide to this day. His orientation is ultimately unknown, but once again, his obit mentions that he was a lifelong confirmed bachelor, so we have really no way of knowing. Another inventor, though, was this wealthy Brazilian inventor and balloon and later on an airplane aviator by the name of Alberto Santos Dumont, who was 31. He was a Brazilian. He attended the fair in June with the intention of competing in a major balloon race. Unfortunately, he found that his balloon had been slashed. He claims it was sabotaged, and so was unable to compete. He remained a confirmed bachelor despite reported multiple female suitors. and unfortunately died at an early age by suicide. Later on, though, he was named as one of the top 10 LGBT Brazilians, and Brazil now claims that he was the first to actually have achieved powered flight and not the Wright brothers. Here he is showing plans for one of his balloons, but Louis Cartier of the fame created the Santos Dumont wristwatch in 1904 for him because he needed that watch to easily tell him the time while he was flying and operating his lighter-than-air balloons, thus popularizing the wearing of wristwatch to today. So there. 20 years ago, there was this graphic novel that was written by Marcello Vital and David Montgomery. The pair came to St. Louis and was selling their graphic novel on the 1904 at St. Louis Pride Fest. I happened to see them at their exhibit, bought a copy, and while talking to them, I asked them if they knew of any connection between LGBT folks and the 1904 World's Fair. And they mentioned that there was this person by the name of Martini that was associated with the 1904 World's Fair. Well, I looked for years and years, and it wasn't until just recently that I actually saw a picture of Martini. But their book refers to the Cabaret Braun, and it says, of course, there's always a gay crowd at Cabaret Braun in Paris, Paris being one of the exhibits on the Pike, the amusement part of the fair, where the bohemian cafe types and racy dancing girls could be found. And this is what the Paris exhibit looked like with the bohemian dancing dancers there. And we can see the star near the Pike there. And we are located not that far in this room from where that would have been exhibited. And Martini was one of the featured dancers, and he was a female impersonator at the fair on the Pike. And because of that, by St. Louis, by modern 2024 terms, could he be considered to be a drag performer on the fair? Interesting. There were a number of supportive cultures that were present at the fair, including Apaches. Now, we know for sure that Geronimo, who is shown here, was very, very likely to be heterosexual, straight. However, his English was not all that good, and he had a Apache translator by the name of Teste, who was 44 at the time, and she had a lifelong lover, in spite of the fact that the two were married and had children by their husbands. In addition to that, there is a Cliff Dwellers exhibit on the Pike featuring Zuni Indians who had, as part of their culture, respect and acceptance of two-spirit people who they called Lahama, of which one of the most famous was Wiwa, rather, who unfortunately had passed away about 6 years before the 1904 World's Fair. But Wawi was definitely respected and well known throughout the Zuni Indian nation because Wawi served as a negotiator between the U.S. government and the Zuni nation, and was actually invited to the White House by President that was president at the time. In addition to that, the Philippine Indians, who had a 47-acre exhibit at the fair, had a similar third gender persons that were part of their culture that were called Bakla or Bayot, and they were basically men who presented themselves as women. So we know that also that there was LGBTQ art and artists on the fair, such as that done by Winslow Homer. This painting was shown at the Art Museum. Also, the Gateway to Pride exhibit has a lot of information about Harriet Hosmer and her creation of the Thomas Hart Benton statue, which was featured there. And in addition to that, there was a sculpture of Baron von Steuben that was created specifically for the 1904 World's Fair exhibit. And he's shown here. He was actually a Prussian general who was recruited by George Washington to help provide leadership and guidance and training for the Revolutionary War troops. And even though it was known that von Steuben had his 17-year-old secretary that came with him, he was still respected and the like at the time. In addition to that, there was music that was composed by LGBTQ people at the fair, including these familiar composers who are generally known to have been either bisexual or gay. And so with all of this in mind, we ask ourselves ultimately how many LGBTQ people, in addition to those folks, attended the 1904 World's Fair. Well, we know for sure that over 20 million people attended the fair during those 185 days that the fair was open. If we take that, do a little bit of math, we know that there was an average of 105 people at the fairgrounds, not including those that actually lived on the fairgrounds. And if we use a very conservative 3.5% as being LGBTQ+, then that meant that there were around 3,700 people that were at the fairgrounds. But if we use the 5.5% figure, then there was almost 6,000 people on the fairground. Doing the math, we come up with a total of between almost 700,000 and over 1 million LGBTQ people likely having attended the 1904 World's Fair. So what would it have been like to have traveled back in time to the 1904 World's Fair? And what would it have been like if you were LGBTQ in 1904? Ultimately, what would your primary everyday concerns be? How would you self-identify yourself? Who could you confide in safely? How would you safely meet other persons like yourself? And finally, what could you do to help to improve your situation in life? Now we know that there's been many changes since 1904, and here we see the front of today's Brookings Hall, but was used by the fair forefathers as their administrative building. That's Washington University, of course. And back in 1904, these are a Mexican delegation standing on those steps in front of Brookings Hall today. But some 74 years later, on those same steps, was a group of LGBT folks who had just finished making the very first march in Washington, LGBT march in Washington in 1980. And if we take a look at the situation for LGBTQ plus people today, we know that homosexuality was declassified as a mental illness by the American Psychological Association 50 years ago this year. There's been significant progress made, and yet we all know about pushback that exists to this very day. We know that there's been a tremendous impact as a result of technology in helping to gain equality and social justice, not only for LGBTQ plus people, but also for other minorities. But we might want to consider what progress have we yet to make, and in addition to that, what will our LGBTQ legacy be 50 years from now? And so we've seen the intersection of two seemingly different worlds, two seemingly different and separate displays, major displays upstairs. We know and have seen that LGBTQ plus people were there all along at that intersection of those two exhibits. They just were not always been seen. So we know that LGBT people were part of the fabric of our 1904 World's Fair history, although their threads of that history were sometimes invisible. And by the same token, we know that LGBTQ people are part of the fabric of our 1904 World's Fair history, even to this day. And I'd like to dedicate this presentation to Mark Eisenberg, who unfortunately passed away 6 months ago, but was not only a volunteer docent at this history museum, but also was a longtime supporter and friend of the 1904 World's Fair Society. Here he is holding a picture, postcard of the 1904 World's Fair. And he also was an active member and board member of the St. Louis Prime Timers Organization, which is a nonprofit organization, social organization for older gay and bi and trans men. And we can see on the right him holding a picture of from the 1904 World's Fair, and he would often be found in front of the statue of St. Louis, greeting people from visiting the St. Louis and showing them what that view looked like 120 years ago. So without further ado, I'd like to give acknowledgement to these people who not only gave valuable information and encouragement, but also helped to make this presentation possible today, including the 1904 World's Fair Society, Primetimer St. Louis, and also the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which provided the first opportunity to do a presentation looking at the intersection of people that would attend the 1904 World's Fair and those who happen to be LGBTQ+.